Well, bonjour. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be with you today and present this very important initiative that we are leading, and as it says on the screen, with the objective for an agriculture with less emissions. So my talk today will focus on one dimension of this very significant challenge that we've heard about from the earlier speakers in the role of agriculture in the global food system and sustainable development. I'm going to focus on the question of greenhouse gases from food production. Before doing this, I just want to reiterate some of the context that we've heard already to some extent, but focus specifically on the question of climate change and the nexus between food security, climate change, and sustainable development. We all are aware, of course, of the Paris Agreement on climate change, and I've just taken some very important pieces of that agreement, paraphrased them to some extent. These are two of the objectives that are equally important in the way the Paris Agreement is constructed. So on one hand, we have one objective to hold the increase in global average temperature to well below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and if possible 1.5 degrees. And, this is the other kicker, and in the context of low greenhouse gas emissions development, this must be done in a manner that does not threaten food production. So this is a significant challenge already. If we look at the broader context of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, we see a number of the goals that have direct relevance to agriculture, namely SDG 2, Zero Hunger, SDG 12, Responsible Consumption and Production, SDG 13, Climate Action, and SDG 15, Life on Land. But, of course, agriculture is relevant to many other goals around economy, gender, etc., as we've already heard today. Now, my main point on this talk, apart from introducing to you the Global Research Alliance, is to say that business as usual is insufficient to meet these challenges. We know, and we've seen in the past, that increasing yield, and if we talk about the metric as being per animal, per hectare, per day, etc., we know that increasing yield in a sustainable way can lead, and not always, but can lead to significant reductions in greenhouse gases per unit of production, whether that be milk or meat or crop or fibre. However, this is insufficient to meet these global goals. And this chart really is just to show that if you look at over successive decades, we see a good trend, which is a diminishing emission per unit of production across major commodities. So the red bar is the cattle meat, and then moving from left to right, we see pig meat, chicken, eggs, rice, milk, cereals. So the trends have been good, but it's insufficient to meet the challenges we face. Now, in terms of the climate challenge we face, analysis has been done by scientists working within the Global Research Alliance and other international research organizations to try and allocate the share of emissions reductions that agriculture should make alongside other sectors to be consistent with a 2-degree world. Okay, so this is modeling, and the result of this modeling was that it was expected that by 2030, the agriculture sector should reduce its emissions by about 1 gigaton below the baseline. That's a significant challenge in itself. If we look at the bottom of this screen, we also see that in terms of food production, that the world will produce or need to produce as much food in the next 50 years as it has done in the case of this analysis in all of human history, but at least in the last 500 years. So to square the circle of reducing emissions significantly, but also meeting this sustained and increased demand in food production is no mean feat. Now, what do we know about the potential today in agriculture to reduce emissions? And I'm only talking about emissions from agricultural production. Okay, I'll come on to sequestration and removals later. So these three models on the top of this chart are the models that underpin this analysis that came to the conclusion that agriculture should reduce by 1 gigaton. So these top three bars, the average is about a gigaton. The bottom two bars demonstrate that using different modeling assumptions, we will get between 21 and 40% of the way with existing technical solutions at a reasonable cost that could be expected to be adopted by farmers. So what we're talking about is a very significant gap in lower cost options, of course, new options that we haven't yet considered, and also the consideration of sequestration of carbon within our soils, and we've heard about this already this morning. So, enter the Global Research Alliance. I won't read to you the objectives of the Global Research Alliance, but just highlight some of the key words. So while the specific focus of the work we do is on reducing greenhouse gases and increasing carbon sequestration, of course we are cognizant of the context in which this takes place. And of course, when you have 30 or 40 countries negotiating a charter, you cannot help but have very long text with all of the words included. But if you wanted to summarize that very quickly, basically we're talking about bringing countries together to grow more food without growing greenhouse gases. Now, in terms of the Global Research Alliance, how it operates and who's involved. Today we have 50 member countries, so it's a global in scope. We have membership from all regions of the world. And these member countries, we estimate, contribute about 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions, so a significant share of the global sector. In terms of the strengths of the Global Research Alliance, we connect science to policy. From Professor Lal earlier about the importance of the political will and the policy. And so in the way the GRA is structured, we have policymakers and scientists working together. Focus is on farm, so we're talking about practical solutions for farmers, ultimately, as a consequence of the research that we undertake. And we always try and focus on where we can add value. So why would we be our best positioned as a global initiative to undertake this particular work, or could it be left for another organization to do? Now, the 50 member countries do not operate in isolation. We have a number of partner organizations, and you can see these on the bottom of the slide. These range from UN organizations like the Food and Agriculture Organization, to regional research and technical support organizations, to multilateral and regional banks, and so on and so forth. We're also an accredited observer of the IPCC. Development, policy, science, technology to try and extend our knowledge into the farms, basically, but utilizing these partnerships too. The work we conduct, we do through 4 research groups focusing on livestock, rice production, crops, and also a group that looks at cross-cutting issues, measurement, a very important issue. How do you measure greenhouse gases? Soil carbon sequestration, other transversal issues. And the way we're structured is very light in terms of democracy. So the Secretariat is based in New Zealand. We are 2 people. All of the rest of the work of the GRA is conducted by member countries, by people in universities, research organizations, and ministries that are the co-chairs and leaders of the different research groups and networks. So it's a decentralized, very light structure to try and be as effective and efficient as possible. So, I mentioned earlier we need to go beyond business as usual. And so, of course, we must have wide-scale adoption of best practice management. So this could be feeding in the case of livestock, or breeding, or selection, and health, and this will increase productivity. Maximizing grain yields, and we know there's a good correlation between, a negative correlation between increasing yields and emissions intensity for many of the cereal crops. Optimization of fertilizer, whether that be the type, the rate, the time, and the placement. We know this can lead to improvements in terms of greenhouse gas efficiency. We must fully exploit the variability within and between systems. If we look at the chart on the right, we see that there are significant differences in emissions intensity within production systems and also between production systems. And the FAO has done analysis which shows that in fact there's as much difference within as there is between. So we need to exploit all possibilities to improve and optimize production systems. And the good news is that in these cases, there is already good reason to do these things. Many times these will link to improved resilience of the production system, improved livelihoods of the farmers, food security, economic development, yet there remain significant adoption gaps. So this is hard even with these additional incentives. However, moving beyond business as usual, and we know we need to do this, there aren't always obvious co-benefits as above, so this presents a huge challenge for science. So how are we trying to address this through the Global Research Alliance? Well, we've organised ourselves in some flagship research projects. So these have been developed and agreed by the membership, and these are the priority research areas that represent the most significant sources of greenhouse gases from agricultural production, where we need to develop fundamental knowledge. First of all, as a cross-cutting issue, the question of measurement and reporting of greenhouse gases, greenhouse gas inventories. You cannot mitigate what you can't measure. We know that today there is a scarce or lack of information around greenhouse gas emissions, particularly when it comes to system-specific or country-specific characterization. We have default sort of average factors, but these do not always represent individual production systems. So we devote significant amount of time to getting the measurement right, building capability within policy and scientific communities within our members to get better estimates of greenhouse gases so we can then know where to target our interventions. Enteric fermentation, one of the single most important sources of methane globally. This comes from ruminant animals digesting their feed. We had very limited knowledge of this ecosystem, so we've done significant work to actually characterize this globally and say how similar are the microorganisms within different wild and domesticated ruminants around the world. The good news is they are very similar. This study was done by the Global Research Alliance, and it tells us that basically, irrespective of the type of animal and where that animal is, the rumen ecosystem is very similar. That's very good news for science because that means we can target interventions that could have very significant global applicability. We look at manipulating this ecosystem through inhibitors and vaccines. These are all new, they don't exist today. We're looking at animal feeds that may have direct reductions in emissions if they are consumed by the animal. And we're looking at the selection and rapid screening of low emissions animals. So this is actually choosing traits that are low emissions, okay? We've identified these in sheep, and we are beginning breeding programs now, and we are beginning on cattle soon. In the case of rice production, we are looking at how to promote the wide-scale adoption of better practices of water management to reduce methane emissions substantially in both Latin American region and the Asian region. And we're also beginning work to look at, again, like animals, can we identify different cultivars of rice that actually have a lower emission, a lower emissions transmission of methane through the stem of the rice plant. And finally, on soil carbon sequestration, this Musk talked about, hopefully, a solution. We have a significant work program to try and quantify better the potential for soil carbon sequestration, and, for example, how we actually could achieve the 4 per mille, the 4 per thousand goal that has been led by France at COP21, I think it was. And also monitoring and modeling of soil organic carbon under different production systems. So we have a general idea globally that there's lots of potential, but when it comes to specific farms, we have very limited knowledge. So we're focusing our efforts there. We also must consider the implications of increased soil carbon sequestration or the practices that could lead to it for other things like emissions of nitrous oxide, emissions of methane, drought tolerance, adaptation, and so on. And finally, the costs and benefits of transitioning to practices that would increase soil carbon sequestration. So that concludes my time. Thank you very much for your attention, and welcome to take any questions over the course of the next day and a half. Thank you.